Hello everybody, Mark Schaftlein with you, and this is the Schaftlein Report. It's Wednesday's edition, and we're broadcasting bi-coastal today from Irvine, California, and from New Jersey. Dr. Michael Busler, welcome back to Schaftlein Report. Happy to have you as my guest on this momentous day.
Well, thanks for having me, Mark. As you know, it's always my pleasure to be here.
Michael, this is literally right up your alley. I mean, today the news hit the tape that the Consumer Price Index rose 9.1% in June, the highest increase year over year in 41 years. Michael, we've had some high inflation. This number even surprised some of the economists. For the benefit of our audience, give us a little background. How did we get here, and what are your thoughts on where we are right now and how to get out of this mess?
Okay, so the first question is, why is inflation so high? How exactly did we get here? Now, the Biden administration will say that it's mostly caused by President Putin's invasion of Ukraine, and that drove up energy prices and some food prices. There's not much they can do about that, and that was a major cause of inflation. Secondly, the administration would say the supply chain issues that we've had as a result of the shutdown due to COVID have not been resolved yet, and that's the other part of the inflation problem. Now, I disagree with both of those. Why is that? They say Putin invasion has caused energy prices to go up, and the logic is that, well, Putin invaded, the Western world is not buying any more oil, that reduction in supply, not getting to these countries is causing prices to go up. Now, why don't I agree with that? Russia is producing more oil today than they were producing before the pandemic. While it is true, the U.S. and at least by the end of the year, Europe will stop buying Russian oil, all they did was drop the price a little bit, and they started selling everything to China and India. So in total, the world supply is about the same as it was prior to Putin's invasion. So that's not really what's causing energy prices to rise. Secondly, Biden blamed it on the supply chain. We can't get all the goods there, the shortages. He's trying to do what he can, he says, to fix that. Now, why do I disagree with that? Because as of last summer, the U.S. is producing at a rate that's greater than before the pandemic. So total supply today is higher than it was prior to the pandemic. So while we do see shortages in certain markets, computer chips driving up the price of automobiles and a few other markets, overall, that's not contributing to what's causing the inflation problem. So I disagree with that. So the next question is, well, what is causing the inflation problem? So in my view, there are four reasons why we have inflation. Reason number one, with regard to energy, the Biden administration from day one took action to reduce the supply of fossil fuels because he wants the country to wean off of fossil fuels and onto renewable energy. How does he do that? He restricted the supply of oil and gasoline. How did he do that? He canceled the Keystone Pipeline. He withdrew leases to draw on federal lands. He drew the leases to drill in Anwar province off the coast of Alaska. He added numerous regulations to the permitting process, which drove up the cost for firms to produce. And he told banks, if I was you, I wouldn't lend in the petroleum industry because they have no future. So the reduction in the supply has caused energy prices to go up, and gasoline prices were up significantly even before Putin did anything. So reason number one, energy inflation. Reason number two, the federal government has been paying people not to work. How did they do that? People became unemployed. They stretched out the 13 weeks to 26 weeks, eventually up to 52 weeks and beyond. And the federal government added $600 a week to whatever unemployed people were getting from the state. When that ran out, they made it $300 a week. So all people have been able to save much of that money, and as a result, there's less of an incentive for them to go back to work. I spoke with some younger people under 25, and I asked them, listen, you haven't worked in 2 years. Why aren't you going back to work? And they told me, well, the federal government gave us all this stimulus money. The federal government added to my unemployment and let me collect for a long time. I haven't paid rent on my apartment for 2 years, and I can't get evicted because there's a moratorium. And some said, look, I had a school loan, but I haven't paid that in 2 years either. So most of them were saying to me, as long as we have this money and we don't have to work, we're going to stretch this out as long as we can. So business said, to get these people back, I'm going to have to start raising wages up significantly to try to lure these people back into the workforce. And I say, well, it's good for the worker. They're making more wages, which is true. However, it drives up labor costs for business. And since their energy costs are also going up, that's driving up their costs, which are also pushing up prices. That's 2 reasons. The other 2 reasons, which I think have a greater effect, have to do with the excess demand in the economy. Where did that come from? In the last 2 fiscal years, the federal government spent nearly $6 trillion more than they brought in tax revenue. On a $23 trillion annual economy, dumping $6 trillion in excess demand simply pulls prices up. So the huge government budget deficits have pulled up prices. And fourthly, what I call the shockingly irresponsible monetary policy by the Federal Reserve has caused at least half of this inflation. Why do I say that? Typically, the best measure of inflation at the consumer level is the consumer price index. Before the pandemic, the consumer price index increased by 1/10 or 0.2% per month. So if it does that for 12 months, you're looking at about a 2% annual inflation rate, and that's where it's been prior to the pandemic. In January of 2021, the consumer price index went up 0.3% in January, 0.4% in February, 0.6% in March, 0.8% in April. Clearly, we had an inflationary problem at the beginning of 2021. Usually, the Federal Reserve stays ahead of this. If there's even a hint of inflation, they'll start to take some action so it doesn't get out of hand. Instead, last year in March and April, they said, don't worry about this. This is temporary. What was the word they used? Transitory.
Yep.
This is transitory, and don't worry, it'll go away. So they kept increasing the money supply by buying $120 billion per month of government bonds, and they buy it simply by printing up money. So you're increasing the money supply. And secondly, they kept interest rates near zero for the entire year. Had they reduced the bond buying program in 2021 and started to gradually nudge up interest rates, we'd have half the inflation rate that we have today. So why do we have the inflation? Supply chain issues are not a major cause, and neither is Putin a major cause. The reason that we have this inflation that we have today, increased energy policies due to Biden's increased energy prices, rather, due to Biden's policy, increased wage inflation due to the government paying people not to work, huge government budget deficits creating excess demand, and the president wants to spend even more going forward. And 4, the shockingly irresponsible monetary policy, which kept interest rates near zero and kept expanding the money supply. So those are the 4 reasons. Now, the Federal Reserve is the only one left to really fix this. So now, instead of taking interest rates up gradually, which they should have started over a year ago,
Right.
Now they're going to have to get very aggressive. They raised it 0.75% last month, unheard of in the last 25 years. And they're going to meet in about 2 weeks. They're going to raise it at least 0.75 point. And after this inflation report, perhaps a full 1 percentage point. That's going to cause some additional problems in the economy going forward.
Michael, that analysis is spot on. And for our listeners and viewers, compare what Michael just shared with you to what you hear on a lot of the mainstream media outlets. It's a different analysis, folks. But Michael, you've called this, I went back, like I was telling you before the show, I went back and reviewed our previous tapes. more than 90% of the stuff that you and I have talked about over the past year has come to fruition. And now we have a situation today where the people on Wall Street are talking about a 75 to 100 basis point increase. And then the analysis among well-respected economists is, well, that should do it. With the combination of commodities, corn, oil, a lot of them going down much further than corn and oil have over the past month. A lot of commodities are down 50, 60, 70%. People are saying, well, between the combination of lower commodity prices, increasing the interest rates, we should be able to solve this problem after the Fed has its next increase. And I'm sitting here saying, wait a second, not so fast here. I mean, we just hit 9.1. Now maybe we'll come down hitting the 8s, or maybe we have a 7 handle. But Michael, the American public, they believe we're going to, even 3 years from now, we could be looking at 6 to 7% inflation. And you and I know that does not work. I mean, that is just an entirely too high of a figure. So I'm sitting here saying, yes, commodity prices have come down. Oil is temporarily down. And it appears to me it's down because of maybe what's going on in China, not necessarily the U.S. But I'm looking at a scenario here where I see multiple rate increases coming up, not just 75 or 100, and we're done.
And I would agree with you, Mark. They're going to raise it, as I said, at the end of the month, at least 3/4 of a point and perhaps a full point. It will not be enough to take out all the excess demand in the economy. I think they're going to have at least 2 and perhaps 3 more rate increases before the end of the year. Now, what that's doing, the economy right now, I believe, is in recession. Now, why do I say that? First quarter GDP declined by 1.6%. Second quarter GDP, and we'll get the number at the end of July, most economists think it'll be slightly positive. I think it's going to be negative, probably in the 1.5% to 2.5% range negative. If that's the case, that will be 2 successive quarters of negative growth in GDP, which is the historical definition for recession. Mm-hmm. Now, I'll tell you, how will the Biden administration respond to that? And before I get to that, so what we have here is high inflation, an economy that's not growing. Even at best, it's stagnant. Even if it's not negative, it'll at least be stagnant for the first 6 months. Well, if you have a stagnant economy with high inflation, that's called stagflation. And we haven't seen that problem since the late 1970s. So that's another problem that we're going to have to deal with. And as the Federal Reserve tries to reduce demand by raising interest rates, it will also tend to make the recession a little bit worse. So the Federal Reserve, because they waited so long to act, is in a very difficult position. In addition to that, the price that American consumers are paying for necessities, food, gasoline,
rent,
even rent on their house or apartment, those things are going up. So as necessities go up in price, consumers say, look, I have to pay for necessities. I have to eat, I have to get to work, I have to have a shelter, a roof over my head. So I have to pay more for that. That leaves less money left over for what we call discretionary items. So demand for those discretionary items, that is anything that's not a necessity that you would buy, is going to go down, and that's going to slow economic activity. I just read Target has a whole bunch of excess inventory. Their grocery department's doing exceptionally well, but the rest of the store is not doing well, and they loaded up with inventory. So now they're going to have to reduce price to sell that inventory off, which means they'll be buying less goods and services going forward, and that's likely to make the recession a little bit worse. So we're stuck here with high inflation. I think economy in a recession at the very best is at least stagnant. So we have this stagflation problem, and it's a very difficult problem to solve. And you bring up an excellent point. American consumers are worried, hey, is this going to go into 2023 and 2024? And the answer is there's a good chance it will. I don't see the Biden administration doing the things they need to fix this. Now, their representatives say, look, they're working 24/7 to do everything they can to reduce inflation. I would just like to ask, what exactly are they doing? And in fact, what some of the president has proposed, he's trying to, working with Senator Schumer, he's trying to get some of the spending bills back in place. And he wants to spend even more money. That's going to add more excess demand to the economy and make the inflation problem worse. So he's not going to reverse his energy policy, which I think he should have done a year ago. Shouldn't have put it in the first place, but he should reverse that. And he's not going to reduce government spending. So as a result, consumers could be right. We could end up with this problem going well into next year or beyond.
Yes, a lot of consumers feel that it may take 3 years for us to get sub 3% inflation. And Michael, we talked about this a little bit too. When you take everything that you just said, now couple that with news earlier today that there's a potential increase in Social Security, 10 to 10.5%. I mean, a lot of people getting it might think, oh my God, thank goodness that's going to help me out. That's going to add more pressure to the demand issue. And Michael, isn't it also going to put this at risk, not on the Social Security side, that number will be what it's going to be, but isn't the biggest risk, taking everything that you just mentioned into account, the real possibility we could see a wage price spiral?
Yeah, that's a huge fear. So what exactly does that mean? So now we have inflation that's running at 9%. So organized labor said, look, I want to negotiate a contract. I need to get a raise more than 9% just to stay ahead of inflation. So I want 10 or 11%. Well, business has to give in to that, or eventually they do. And then they go back and say, you know, my labor costs just went up 11%. Well, coupled with my energy costs, which are also going up, it's going to mean it costs more to produce goods and services. I'm going to have to raise my prices 10% just to keep up with that. And then if inflation gets higher the next year, labor says, hey, I need a raise even greater. And you get into what we call a classic wage price spiral. The only way to end that is to have a very severe recession. So I don't know what's going to happen going forward, but there's certainly things that we should worry about. And I share the American public's concern.
Well, I think being honest with the American public is the first step in the equation.
Yes.
And that's not something that this administration's been known to do. I mean, no. to think they would consider, even on a smaller version, trying to build back better, when the Federal Reserve is raising interest rates, when the Federal Reserve is trying to reduce the money supply by QT, quantitative tightening, I mean, it's just not common sense that you should do something like that. But let's talk about some of the things that the market is telling us right now, Michael. Earlier today, I looked at the spread, and folks, that's what I'm talking about here is the difference between 2-year notes and 10-year notes. Now, typically, you would want to see, if you're an investor, the longer duration, you would expect to get a higher interest rate for. Lesser duration, you would have a lower interest rate. Michael, we have a situation now where the 2-year note is yielding, let me just check my figures here, it's 3.12. The 10-year note was 2.94. We have a 17 basis point spread where it's higher the 2-year than the 10-year. Yesterday, that number was 8.5 basis points. Michael, in one day, we've gone to 17. Isn't that normally a precursor to having a recession when you see the short-term notes invert over long-term notes?
Yes. So let me just recap what you just said. So when an investor lends money, what you do when you're buying some kind of a bond, the more risk you take, the more return you expect to get. Right. So if I buy a 1-year note, I'm taking just 1 year's worth of risk. I can figure that out. If I'm buying a 10-year note, who knows what's going to happen in 10 years? There's much more risk. So a normal yield curve has long-term rates higher than short-term rates. Right. Now, if investors feel the economy is going into recession and a few years down the road, interest rates will drop significantly, then they're willing to pay more. They get higher yields in the short term than they do in the long term. And we end up, and again, they'll accept lower yields because they feel a recession will bring interest rates down. So now we end up with, as you point out, what's called an inverted yield curve. Short-term rates are higher than long-term rates. About 75% of the time that happens, again, to be fair, about 75% of the time that happens, a recession follows shortly. So it's not a ironclad sign that a recession is coming. But if you take that information, add it into what we saw in the first quarter of this year and what's likely to see in the second quarter of this year, I think the yield curve is accurately predicting a recession coming up, if we're not in one already, very shortly.
You know, the one of the main culprits, or one of the main things that happened as a result of all the money printing by the Fed, the government spending, you know, the $6 trillion plus what the Fed was doing, we had an incredible bubble in the housing market. I mean, effectively, you had free money. Prices, I mean, it got to an escalation point, Michael. You put a house on a market, 5 people bidding, and they're bidding over the asking price. Well, those days appear to be behind us.
Exactly.
Yeah, Bill.
So,
yeah, please go ahead, because
I was just going to say, I was just going to make a comment on that. So housing prices have gone up close to 20% a year for the last 2 years. Why is that? There are people that said, you know, I wasn't necessarily considering buying a new house, but the federal government gave me all this stimulus money, and I wasn't really negatively impacted economically by the virus. Most people ended up saving that money. Personal savings shot up to over 10% of income. It's usually in the 3 to 5% range. So people said, look, the government gave me enough money for the down payment, and you know what? I can get a 2.5% mortgage. Never in my lifetime have I seen that. Right. Now is the time to buy. Hundreds of thousands, even millions of people got into the housing market. There's only so many houses. They only built so many houses. Huge, high demand, low supply, and that led to housing prices going up significantly. Now, what's happening now? The Federal Reserve says, I've got to get some of that demand out of the housing market. How will I do that? I'll raise interest rates. You can't get a 2.5%, 3% mortgage anymore. Today, it's at least 6. It'll probably be 8 by the end of the year. So a lot of people say, well, I can't afford a house now. I'm going to have to drop out of the market, which is what the Federal Reserve wants them to do. Unfortunately, the mainstream media is going to say, oh, they raised rates and look at all these people. They can't afford houses now. What a horrible thing that this is. They're forced out of the market. That's what the intent is, to reduce the demand in the market. And who always falls out first? You know, the lowest income earners. When prices go up, they're the ones who have to drop out. Higher income workers, prices go up and they can afford it. So those are the people that are going to be forced out of the market, which was what the Federal Reserve does. But the press will make it look horrible that they're ruining the American dream for young people.
Yeah, well, if they don't do that, they're going to have the problem is only going to get worse. I mean, you've seen builders saying, again, demand literally in some areas of the country has fallen off a cliff. And you know, if you effectively, and you're right, 2.5% interest rates, and now you're at 6, so you've tripled, you know, what the cost of borrowing was. And Michael, one other thing. Over the past couple of years, a lot of these homes, particularly in what I call the lower to mid price, got snapped up by institutional investors.
Exactly.
And okay, so that made it even more difficult for your first time or your second time home buyer. So you couple that with the fact that now these interest rates are ticking up. My big fear is we could become more of a country of more renters. And as you're well aware, rent is a key component to the consumer price index. Michael, it seems all these options that the Federal Reserve or the government's doing, yes, there's some benefit, but there's also some risk. And that to me is like a red flag, just staying up saying, pay attention to me here, be careful.
Yeah, they waited so long to act. And also the Biden administration's economic goals, economic policy are not geared to solve the economic problems. Normally, or when you set your fiscal and monetary policy, the goals are price stability, keep inflation low, full employment, keep unemployment low, and growth in the economy. Instead, the Biden's fiscal policy is all geared to solving real or perceived social injustices. Injustice CEOs make more than everybody else. There's injustice somebody borrowed money to college and actually has to pay it back. It's injustice that everybody doesn't have health care. It's injustice everybody doesn't have daycare. So let's spend money to fix all those things. And also we have a climate change problem, the Biden administration would say. So let's spend a lot of money to fix that. So we're spending all that money, which increased the aggregate demand in the economy and went against the economic goals. Every time they do what they're doing, it's going to lead to more inflation, not price stability. Eventually, the high inflation will cause people to cut back on what they are spending for those discretionary items. So that'll slow down the economy. So we won't have growth anymore. And eventually, when this labor shortage is resolved, and I think it's only 4, 5, 6 months away from being completely resolved, eventually the unemployment rate is going to go up. So if you concentrated the economic policy on economic goals, we wouldn't be in this position where we are today.
Yeah, I mean, it just seems like, I can remember the day, Michael, when we first met. I remember the Federal Reserve, this is really early on in the Biden administration, was talking about how we could get inflation up because it wasn't high enough. And you and I had a discussion about this, and I'm like, why would they be doing that? I said,
it's a head scratcher.
It is a head scratcher because I remember we had this conversation. I said, what's wrong with 1%? I mean, why does it have to, what's so magical about 2? Why do they keep pushing? And then inevitably, Janet Yellen got it wrong, and unfortunately, Jerome Powell did too. Now Yellen's at it again. I've got a question, Michael. I study it pretty good, but I'm a little perplexed by this one. Janet Yellen is over in Asia right now, and she's floating this idea about capping the price that countries will pay for Russian oil. Now, I'm a little confused by this.
Yes.
Can you give me some guidance on this about? It's just something in the back of my head says nothing can go right if that's what she's thinking about doing. I see pitfalls everywhere. Michael, what say you?
This is a head scratcher, but I think look, she's a very intelligent lady.
Yes.
She has an Ivy League PhD. She taught at Cal Berkeley for forever.
Yeah.
She's been chair of the Federal Reserve. She's a very intelligent lady, but she too is looking at social goals and climate change instead of taking a look at setting economic policy to reach the economic goals. So what she's saying is, look, the Biden administration and Europe said, Russia invaded Ukraine. We're going to hurt them. We're not going to buy any more of their oil. That'll hurt them. They'll lose all this revenue, and it should help Ukraine to not win the war, at least hold things back. So we did that, and Russia said, well, okay, if you're not going to buy my oil, India and China, I'll drop the price $5 a barrel. India and China will take all of it. So Russia is producing more now than they were prior to the invasion. So now Janet Yellen says, well, we can't stop Russia from selling the oil because we can't tell China and India not to buy it. So now let's say we're going to set a cap. If oil today is down to about $100 a barrel, we're going to say you can't pay any more than $90 for Russian oil. So if they tried to do that, Russia would simply say, no, I'm not going to sell it to you. And if you want to go, I'll sell it to you for $95. And that's below market, so it's an advantage to you to buy it. But I'm not dropping the price down any lower. I don't have to. So I don't understand how she thinks she's going to be able to pull this off. She simply won't be able to do it. And with all due respect, and again, I know she's an intelligent lady, she's been wrong about everything.
Yes.
She said the inflation is transitory. She said you can increase the money supply as much as you want. It won't lead to inflation. And people say, well, that's not what monetary theory says. Well, that's fine. We have a modern monetary theory that says you can do that. And I was writing from day one that this will never work.
Right.
And then she tried to say, well, if we spend money, but it helps business, it's not really increasing demand. It's really going to increase supply. So now she said we have modern supply side economics, which also doesn't make any sense. So, and again, I don't want to criticize her in that. I know she's very smart and knows what she's doing. But the problem is she's trying to reach these social goals with economic policy instead of trying to reach economic goals with economic policy. The cap on price simply won't work. It's really a waste of time.
Yeah, it seems like they've got it backwards. I mean, in the middle of a crisis, and again, I'm speaking politically now, you need to set aside some of your social goals to get the ship righted. In other words,
exactly.
If we can focus on the social goals after we get the economic goals in place.
Exactly.
And if they continue doing it the other way, look, we got an election coming up this October, November. My belief sitting here today is that Republicans will take control of the House of Representatives. The Senate, it could go either way, but
I agree.
Bad policy, which has come out of the House, and thank God a lot of it didn't make it through the Senate, that will be over come October, November when we have the elections. But there, Michael, my fear is there's still time for the administration to do some damage, because I agree with you. They've shown no interest at pivoting. I mean, I really wish they would, but I don't see that. I see the president going to Saudi Arabia this week. My understanding, and Macron told him this when he was over in Europe last week, there's no more capacity to produce. In other words, the world is producing pretty close to what it's capable of. And even if we could produce more, Michael, there's not enough refining capacity globally to do a whole lot about this. Am I right, or am I off base on that?
No, I think you're hitting this completely right. You can't just go ask people to start producing more oil, especially when we can produce more right here.
Yes.
During the last administration, at the peak, we were producing 12.5 million barrels a day. We're down to about 11 million barrels a day because of Biden's actions. If he reversed those, then we'll be able to increase our oil production again and bring prices down for energy. He won't do that because he's more concerned with climate change and getting in renewable energy than he is with really some sound economic policies. And the more he keeps doing this, the worse the problems get. You know, you mentioned the word, why doesn't he pivot? I would say, why doesn't he listen to some of the more successful Democratic presidents?
Yeah.
Look at Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton, in 1994, they lost the House of Representatives. He knew he had to run again. So he said, I've got to give the people what they want. So what do the people want? They want lower taxes. He lowered the capital gains tax from 28 to 20%. People don't want free welfare. He changed it into a workfare program rather than welfare. And his exact words were in his 1996 State of the Union speech, the exact words were, the era of big government is over.
Yep.
And that's what the people wanted. And it allowed him to become president and get reelected again. President Obama did the same thing.
Yeah.
He got in 2008. He got all these social programs put in. They got clobbered in 2010. Right. He started to reverse some of his policies, and he was able to get reelected. So don't listen to the public if you don't want to, I would say, the president. Don't listen to the Republicans. Listen to the most successful Democratic presidents in the past and see what they do.
Yeah, I heard a commentary the other day on my way in to do the show, and someone said, well, this really feels a whole lot like Jimmy Carter. And he said, are you comparing President Biden to President Carter? He goes, well, in a way. And he said, that's an insult to President Carter. You know, because for all his faults, Carter was like a nuclear scientist. I mean, he was a smart guy. He just made some mistakes. But what's happening now, in my opinion, it dwarfs what we were dealing with back then. Why do I say that? Because we're $30 trillion in debt right now. And we have a government controlled by Democrats right now that continue this deficit spending. And
exactly. Everything
that we've talked about here, Michael, I mean, they've got to come up with some solutions here. Otherwise, if you come back in 30 or 40 days and we're sitting there having this conversation, we're going to be talking about more problems. A couple minutes left. Is there any chance, I think I know what you're going to tell me, but I'm going to ask the question anyhow. Is there any chance the Fed could overshoot and tighten too much?
There's a great chance that's going to happen, and it likely will happen. Because now that they're focused on bringing prices down, they'll do whatever they have to. This is an extremely aggressive rate hikes that they're going through, and yet the inflation is still running at 9%. Mostly because it takes about 3 to 6 months for Fed policy to actually filter through the economy. But in the meantime, they're going to meet the end of the month. They're looking at 9.1% inflation. They're going to have to raise interest rates. Yeah. And they'll meet again, I think, in August or September. Inflation will still be high. They're going to have to raise interest rates even higher. Now, the thing is, as you mentioned, as you raise them too much and you take out too much demand, given all the other problems with inflation, reducing demand for discretionary goods, you're likely to get a big slowdown in the economy. And if we're not already in recession, which again, I think we are, but if we're not in recession, we certainly will be after the next quarter. So yeah, I agree with you.
One final thing here. You know, in 2021, crypto was the big issue. Oh my God, everybody's bending over, jumping over themselves to invest in crypto. Well, now we're seeing the other side of the mountain. Crypto banks are blowing up. There was a firm that blew up the other day that in March they had $10 billion assets under management. Now the founders of the firm are on the run. Prices are collapsing in that market everywhere. Michael, I'm not trying to be facetious. A lot of people are in pain over this, but is that big enough to have sort of the snowball effect to where it affects other assets? What's happening in the crypto market?
Well, there's so much money tied up in crypto. It's in the trillions. I don't know what the number exactly is. There's so much money tied up that as the value of that goes down, it's going to have negative impacts on the economy. Economists have something they call the wealth effect, which means if you feel wealthier, you're likely to spend more money. If your stock's going up, the value of your house going up, you feel wealthier, you're likely to spend money. If the value of your assets go down and the stock market's plummeted, crypto has plummeted, housing prices haven't gone down yet, although in some markets they're starting to. Now investors are going to say, well, I don't feel so wealthy anymore. I just lost 20% of my stocks. Just lost it. That's going to cause them to cut back on some of their spending too. So the rippling effect of that will be to cut down on economic activity and make a recession even worse. With regard to cryptocurrency specifically, this was always a head scratcher to me. It doesn't have any intrinsic value. They say they limit the supply and whatever the demand is will carry up the price. But I recall that the federal government was investigating somebody and they were able to break the code of some of these cryptocurrencies. So if that happens, now you have a supply that can't be controlled, and I see the prices going down significantly. Part of the increase in the price too was due to the fact that people had so much money, mostly that the government gave them. So, well, I'll take a chance. I'll put 10,000 into cryptocurrency. The government, the average family of four, got over $11,000 in free money in the stimulus package, whether you were negatively impacted economically by the virus or not. So people said, well, it's free money anyway, let me take a shot. So a lot of people started to do that, bid up the prices, and Bitcoin at one time was over $60,000. I think they're down in the 20s now. I'm not sure that's ever going to recover to where it was before. Now, a lot of people disagree with me, and I'll admit I'm not an expert in cryptocurrency, but I have a tough time seeing it recovering back to the prices that it did before.
Wow.
Negative impact on the economy, I don't know how significant it will be.
Michael, your inputs today, I tell you what, folks, sharp as a tack. The predictions have come true. Mike, 30 seconds left. Where are we going to be at the end of the year? Where will you think the inflation rate will be around election time? Give me your thoughts on that.
I think you're looking in the 8 to 9% range. Certain things, as you mentioned, have already started to come down in price. Gasoline's down about 5%, 8% from its peak. A lot of commodities, because the world economies are slowing down, a lot of commodities are dropping in price. So I don't think the inflation rate is going to go much higher, but I don't see it dipping real fast in the next 3, 4, 5 months. We're probably looking at about 8, 9% inflation rate by election time.
Michael, I look forward to having you back here shortly because we'll talk about these predictions. And again, folks, you heard it from the expert here today. I mean, what a different perspective than you're going to hear listening to any of the mainstream media outlets. Michael, I cannot thank you enough for joining us, and our audience is really appreciative of the insight and advice you gave them today.
Thank you so much, Mark. I look forward to doing it again.
Okay, folks, that's it for today. Take the lessons learned, put them where it's saved the tape, and we will be back tomorrow. We'll cut through the propaganda, get you through the week. Have a good evening. Thanks for viewing and listening today.